Good afternoon and welcome to this Book at Lunchtime event on Sophocles, Antigone and Other Tragedies, written by, or translated by, and written by Professor Oliver Taplin. My name is Wes Williams and I'm the director here at Torch. I'm delighted to be welcoming Oliver here to speak about his book today. Also on the panel are Dr. Lucy Jackson and Professor Karen Leeder, who will be chairing the discussion. Sophocles' Antigone and Other Tragedies is an original and distinctive verse translation of Antigone, Deianira and Electra. These books in Oliver's version convey the vitality of Sophocles' poetry and also the vigor of the plays in performance. In a moment, I'll hand over to Professor Leeder, who will fully introduce the book and the rest of the panel. This will be followed by a reading by Oliver from the translations. Afterwards, our commentators will present their thoughts and questions on the book, coming at it from their different disciplines. We'll then give Oliver the chance to respond to some of the points raised before entering into what I hope will be a really interesting, broader discussion with questions also from you, the audience. So as the chat box already says, please do send your questions in as we go through the next hour or so. It's a great pleasure to be here to introduce this third Book at Lunchtime of this term from Torch. It's our flagship event series, taking the form of fortnightly bite-sized discussions with a range of commentators. In life before the pandemic, we would have invited you into a room here in Torch or here in Oxford, and there might have been lunch. One of the advantages, clearly, of this situation is that we can all be doing this from wherever we are, including across the world. Sadly, however, the lunch has got to be virtual, but there's certainly food for thought in what's to come. Please do take a look at our website and newsletter for the full programme next term. I'll say a bit more about this at the end of today's discussion. All that's left for me to do now is to thank you for coming and to introduce our chair, Karen Leeder. Professor Karen Leeder is Professor of Modern Languages at Oxford University and a Fellow in German at New College, Oxford. She's published widely on modern German culture and is a prize-winning translator and writer, a prize-winning translator of contemporary German literature, most especially poetry, recently winning the English Pen Award and the American Pen Heim Award for her translation of Ulrike Almut-Sandig. She was, a while back, a Torch Knowledge Exchange Fellow with the South Bank Centre, and since then she works with MPT, Modern Poetry and Translation, Poet in the City, the Poetry Society, and has a brilliant project which I would recommend you go and have a look at online, which is called Mediating Modern Poetry. Karen, thanks ever so much for chairing today's panel. I'll hand over to you now and return for questions towards the end.
Thank you very much, Wes. I'm delighted to be here. And with no further ado, because I know we've got so much exciting material to cover, I'd like to introduce, first of all, Oliver Taplin, but also Lucy Jackson, and then we'll move to Oliver Taplin's reading. So Professor Oliver Taplin is an emeritus professor of classics at Oxford University. His research has focused on the reception of poetry and drama, particularly through performance and material culture in both ancient and modern times. He co-founded the Archive of Performance of Greek and Roman Drama and has collaborated on a number of high-profile theatre productions. Which becomes important, I think, because we've got to remember this is drama we're talking about. In recent years, he has turned his attention to translating Greek drama as verse to be spoken and performed. Dr. Lucy Jackson is Assistant Professor in Classics and Ancient History at Durham University. Her research focuses on ancient Greek and Roman theatre and performance again, Neo-Latin translations of Greek drama, and the reception of classical theatre in the 16th century, and translation studies and theory in the ancient and modern worlds. Her most recent publication is The Chorus of Drama in the 4th Century BCE. So now I'd like to invite Oliver Taplin to present some readings from this wonderful book, Sophocles, Antigone, and Other Verse Tragedies, which is out this year with OUP.
Oliver, you're muted.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm unmuted now. Thank you, Karen. It's great to have a captive audience, as long as you don't press the leave button down in the right-hand corner. I'm going to read you a brief extract from each of the 3 plays in this volume, plays which I've thought of together as being Sophocles' female plays. The other volume has Sophocles' 4 male plays. So one extract from each play to give you some idea of the kind of registers and the kind of rhythms that I've attempted to bring out. So first, Deianira. Deianira is more familiarly known as Trachiniae, or the women of Trachis, but I've preferred Deianira so that she is the leading woman of the play, so that each of the 3 plays is named after its leading woman. It's the least known probably of Sophocles' plays. I think it should be much better known. It's a wonderful play. It brings together in a very modern way, really, monstrosity, and monstrous deeds of men, and domesticity and settlement, and lust and sex is the link between the 2 that destroys them both. And to give you the setting for this reading, Heracles has been away. He's been away a long time on various expeditions. He's now returning victorious, and he's sent ahead the woman who is his latest infatuation. And Deianira has discovered that he means to keep this young beauty in her house. And in this extract that I'm going to read, she comes outside to confide in the women of the chorus what she means to do about this. So Deianira coming out, talking to the chorus. I've slipped out secretly to you, dear women, while our visitor is talking to those captive girls inside before he goes. I want to tell you of the action that I have in hand and seek your sympathy for what I'm going through. I have, you see, let in a girl, and yet no more a simple girl, I think, a fully harnessed woman. I've taken her on board the way a merchant stows a cargo, but these goods will wreck my peace of mind. And now the 2 of us shall lie beneath a single coverlet and wait to see which one he will embrace. Is this the kind of payment that the so-called good and trusty Heracles has sent me in return for caring for his house through such a stretch of time? I'm not able to be angry with him when he's afflicted with so virulent a fever. Yet, what woman could bear living with her here and share in one man's making love? I'm aware how youth for one of us is coming into bloom and fading from the other, and how men's eyes will turn from that and want to pick the flower. And so my fear is that while Heracles will be in name my husband, he shall really be the younger woman's male. So I'll now read you a piece from Electra. If we can change the slide. There we are. Thank you. This is, so that speech from Deianira has a kind of restrained resentment behind it. I mean, it's deeply emotional and jealous, but at the same time, she's holding back in order to reveal what it is that she's going to do. And I hope you heard the kind of iambic pulse that there is beneath the lines. Now, this extract from Electra also iambic pulse, but from a much more emotional scene. And I think you'll see why I have not gone for a regular line length, because the advantage of varying the length of line and varying the endings of lines between strong and weak syllables is very clear here. This is the most famous scene in the play in many ways. Electra has been waiting years for her brother Orestes to come home and avenge the murder of their father Agamemnon. She doesn't know that he's come back in disguise. And there is a pretense, there's a plot by which it's being pretended that he's dead. And he has now arrived with an urn which is meant to contain his ashes. And Electra laments over this urn, the most terrible, heartrending lament. And he stands there, the person she's lamenting for, through it, unable to know what to do until the end. So here is the very end of Electra's lament over the urn. But our bad fortune, yours and mine, has taken all of that and sent you to me in this form instead of your dear flesh and blood, this ash and futile shadow. Ah, so pitiful your body, sent on such a dreadful journey, and you have destroyed me, dearest, brought destruction on me, brother. So now, please let me in, receive me into this, your home, the nothing me into your nothing place, so I may dwell with you below for all of time. For when you were up here, I used to share in everything with you, and now I long to die so that I'll never be deprived of being with you, even in the grave. And then Antigone, of course, the best known of all of Sophocles' plays, perhaps the best known of all Greek tragedies. I'll read you a piece of lyric. That's to say, this is what's usually known as a choral ode. I'll read you two stanzas. They both have the same meter. They come after the great confrontation scene between Creon and Antigone, where they confront each other and sort of talk across each other. They miss each other with their stances. And then the lyric, the chorus dwell on the kind of destruction, the kind of disaster that can hang around a house, a family, once things go wrong. And for the meters of my choruses, I've not tried to replicate in any way the Greek meter, which works on a very different metric in any case. And I've just found my own rhythms for each pair of stanzas. And I've, generally speaking, made use of rhyme, except that I've used a lot of half rhyme, quarter rhyme, para rhyme. And in this particular one, because it's about the way that things have become disjointed, have gone wrong in this kind of chain of disaster, I don't even really use rhyme so much as what one might call sound patterns between the closing words of lines, and then there are some internal rhymes within the lines until the last line of each stanza. So here are these two stanzas, which ideally I'd love to have them set to music. They should be sung, they shouldn't be spoken, but that's a dream. Happy the life that's lived all untainted by taste of bad. Utter disaster pours on the family and the house, shaken by gods from above, just the way the rolling wave, stirred by a north wind storm, moves sweeping above the gloom, churning up from the bed of the ocean, the black silt cloud, loud on the headland shore, the ranks of the breakers roar. From long ago, the pains of this dynasty pile upon pains constantly from the dead, so the family cannot get freed. Always some god bears down, so they never can break the chain. Oedipus' house was bright with the light of its latest root. Now that has been cut through by the blade of the gods below, blooded by foolish speech and by thoughts beyond reason's reach. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that. It was wonderful to hear it. You talked about, the important sort of qualities of the sound, and hopefully getting them performed and even sung, some of these versions. But it was wonderful to hear it, and I think very important. I have the honour to kick off. To respond, and then I shall pass to Dr. Lucy Jackson. But by way of a kind of immediate three swerves or apologies or tropes of the outsider, I should say, of course, that I'm not a classicist. I generally work on the contemporary. Although I have translated some dead classics myself, where I guess some of the questions might be the same. But also, I'm not imbued with the scholarly context, of course. I don't read ancient Greek. And nor do I generally work with drama. So I feel that on multiple levels, I come at some questions, these texts as an outsider. But of course, I'm fascinated as a translator by the many micro decisions that go up to make, as it were, a finished product and a way of addressing the text. So I hope that my thoughts here have coalesced really into much less a statement, as it were, or a response, but 4.5 questions, really, with some preamble coming from this outside perspective. And the first is the position of the translator. In your introduction, your prologue rather, you say that this version that you've done, these versions, might now be considered, might once have been considered rather free and might now be considered as rather close to the originals. And that prompted me to think about, of course, the context in which we translate and how much we position ourselves as translators. Not only as a general translator, but you're in a particular position, of course, which is the scholarly translator who sits between the academy and a general audience. And that prompted me to think, you mentioned Heaney and Harrison, of course, two great models. There's Anne Carson as well, of course, there. But I wondered really whether you compared the translations with these other translations that are, as it were, out there in the world as sort of public translations, as it were, not academic translations in the strictest sense. But also how you respond to these translations that are in the world where the translator doesn't know the original language. I often think it might be rather a benefit not to know the original language when translating. I don't any longer do that. I have done that occasionally. But of course, you're imbued with the context, and your scholarly introduction and notes allow you to be both a scholar and a translator. In this edition, and I was fascinated in a way how the two versions of yourself, your two positions, worked together, coalesced, contradicted each other, perhaps on occasions. So the position of the translator. The second sort of area which really struck me and which I was fascinated by and which you alluded to in your introduction is a question of the technical. Of course, this is something every translator has to face. And you quote Joseph Brodsky, I think, really helpfully, saying that a translation is a search for an equivalent, not for a substitute. And hence your interest in the verse translation. I thoroughly agree. Hölderlin, the great translator, the German poet and great translator, also from the Greek, talked about finding a material that was foreign and analogous, something that spoke to the spirit, but which acknowledged in its foreignness also the moment of its own being. And I particularly was interested in the form, of course, because it's verse, and I'm so pleased you did verse. I've just emerged from a huge verse translation myself of a kind of epic, so I'm very have been thinking about this a great deal. Your choice not to go for iambic pentameters, as say Emily Wilson did in her translation, obviously of the Odyssey, but to find something that sits not quite comfortably in English, it seems to me, and I hope you don't take that as a criticism, but these trimeters, for example, of the Greek, and the varying line lengths in the English, there's a dynamism about them. But I'm interested in the decision not to go for something that we immediately recognise, iambic pentameter, but to go for something that's in between, slightly unsettled. You talked about a pulse that's basically iambic. And also then these fantastic pieces from the lyrical dialogues, which you mentioned there, and we got a snippet of one, which are rhymed or used pararhyme, and are very contemporary, it seems to me, really contemporary in the use of the pararhyme and the soundscapes rather than close rhyme. It leads to a related issue, which is that it struck me as a very Anglo-Saxon translation, really pacey. And I think the choice of Anglo-Saxon words led to that. So quite far from a sort of Latinate or Greek rhythm in that sense. And I wondered if that's geared to the dramatic presentation, whether you were conscious of that, whether you're doing it when you're doing it, or whether it came out, as it were, in your approach. That leads to a kind of larger sense question about foreignness. And this raises questions of how foreign the translation is, or how far it's domesticated into a recognizable form. And as I've hinted, and I think you wanted, your translation sits somewhere between recognizing the surprise of the foreignness and allowing it to be there, but also sitting enough within our range of vocabulary that we feel comfortable, but then are constantly surprised. Now, of course, this could be seen as against a backdrop of translation theory. Schleiermacher talks about this. Various translators, translation theorists have since. Do you deal with translation theory? I say straight away, I don't. I never do, really, apart from teaching it. But when I'm translating, it's me in the text. But I'd be very interested as to whether you think about questions of foreignness or domestication abstractly, or whether it's about micro choices in the text itself. And that brings me to a kind of next area, really. You wrote really helpfully about the afterlife of these plays, and the reason they're so profoundly important in modern culture, and have continued to be across the century, as being about their kind of mixture of the combination of the immediate and the remote, is what you call it, which links with what we've just been talking about, of course. But also they're capacious enough, in a sense, for people to be called on time and again to respond to them, keep translating them, and keep rethinking them. I suppose what interested me very much is in a few places, and just then you sort of said it again, you talk about a 21st century perspective. For example, in Deianira, the character herself has often been thought of, you explain, as unlikable or deceitful or stupid, but on the contrary, she strikes us very strongly from the 21st century perspective as understandable and forgivable and immediate. And I was interested in whether you think of these characters as psychologically complete and whole, and whether Greek audiences would have thought in that way at all. Antigone too, of course, very powerfully, when Ismay says to her, "You're in love with what's not possible," it seemed to me, a profound character insight there. So are these coherent characters, really? It's the psychological question. But secondly, then, what comes out in a 21st century reading? I think psychology is a 21st century thing. I think we're interested in that, but also power, dilemmas of power. And it seemed to me you really just nailed Creon so brilliantly, with a very contemporary vocabulary, things not happening on my watch, or the dilemmas of power. And the final thing, the half thing, I suppose, is gender, which I wanted to raise, which links with issues of authority and psychology, of course. And the last production I saw of Antigone was Juliette Binoche up in Edinburgh, in the kind of fascinating production 2015, Ivo van Hove, where she very much talked about Creon as a misogynist. And it was seen as a very gendered and powerfully gendered intervention into the text. And I wondered where you stood. Of course, Emily Wilson, when she translated, very complicated ways, got hailed as the first female translator, which isn't true, but had a kind of gendered intervention in the text. And I was fascinated that you'd chosen these female texts and set them against the male texts. And so I'm wondering really whether there is a kind of female language at play here. In these texts that's distinctive, to your mind, from the male language in the earlier plays which you translated. And finally, I noticed the words miasma and sickness and illness and contagion come up again and again. And I wondered whether that is something, of course, that reading now we particularly notice and seems to be incredibly striking to us. So the context. And so perhaps there are my 4.5 questions. I've noticed I've had my time. So I'm going to pass on to Dr. Lucy Jackson, who I'm sure will bring a more classical point of view to bear on these wonderful texts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks everyone for being here. Thank you for inviting me to talk about this. It's a real delight, if not slightly surreal, to be speaking, because I was not only taught tragedy, but I was also taught translation by Oliver. And so to be have the opportunity to kind of almost read back all of the learning that I have had from him in wonderful ways with this latest translation of his is a real treat. So I want to thank you all. Almost picking up on what Karen just sort of ended with, thinking about the subject of these plays, I think it is a really wonderful thing for these 3 women plays to be put together. They're great plays in their own right. They're great plays to be featuring and to be returning to for some of us. But they are a really great place to have as a triptych, I think. As Oliver notes in his introduction, these are plays with women very much at their centre. This is one of the reasons why Greek tragedy is particularly popular nowadays, is because it has these fantastic, weighty female parts. But also something that I particularly noticed in light of some classical scholarship recently is they feature not just women, but women being with other women as well. Sisters, mothers and daughters. And that I think is particularly interesting and lends itself to some very immediate commentary in political theory. There is lots of collaboration going on now between classics and political theory, and the idea of sisterhood. So in Antigone with Antigone and Ismene, in the Electra between Electra and Chrysothemis, is a really hotly debated topic at the moment. So this is not just a wonderful addition to have, but it's also very timely, I think, and the way that these 3 plays talk to each other should provoke and prompt lots of interesting conversations. What I like, and again, this is something that Karen noted already, is that in these translations, we don't shy away from the strangeness of Greek tragedy. Again, this is something that Oliver will know from his decades of scholarship on Greek tragedy, but they do sit in between a world that's very familiar and is also mythical and very far away. And I certainly really appreciate that nowadays, this sort of that these translations stand against an impulse maybe to make something very familiar for new audiences or old audiences, to make it perhaps slightly more easy to consume or completely domesticate, to use the translation theory term. These are plays that in the Greek too, and for their original audiences, posed difficult questions. They were something for us to get our brains around, as well as our mouths, to get our mouths around them. These are plays for speaking. And I really liked how there were throughout these touches which made you kind of just think again, not quite an alienation effect in a sort of Brechtian way, but phrases that were both beautiful but out of the ordinary as well, sort of cramming me full of rage. This of course also lends itself sometimes to sort of slight other echoes that couldn't be predicted. This is a tiny question that I had, but one of the things that Antigone says is she says that she's been cancelled from her own wedding. And nowadays, when we have all of this discourse about cancellation, whether that was an intended effect or it is one of these moments when, just depending on your own approach to it, you suddenly think, oh, where am I now? So being able to exist in a kind of place of tension while reading these plays, I think is really wonderful and very valuable, and something that these translations excel in. I came at this, as Karen said, from a classics perspective, but also from a teaching perspective, and also I'm something of a choral nut myself. I'm always interested in the chorus of Greek tragedy and their own strangeness. So I thought I would look particularly at these translations from those two perspectives. I was really delighted, but not at all surprised at how the choral songs, the lyrics, were rendered in these translations. To take one example, this was set on a course that I taught last year. The opening choral song in Deianira, it almost has a very, very famous opening image of a kind of starry night. And I know for a fact that this is the word aiola used in the Greek has a heritage of its own, because it turns up in a weird way in Martin Crimp's Cruel and Tender as this sort of very important adjective, a way of describing a mood almost at the beginning of the play. And having read gazillions of translations of this opening ode in the last year, I was so delighted to feel how fresh this version was. I wasn't surprised at all, but to use glimmering as a way of translating this very shifty word in the ancient Greek, I thought was just wonderful. That whole ode, it felt fresh and crunchy at the same time. It was a bit like treading out in some of the snow that we've had recently. It gave that feeling of, this is something new. So that was a real delight. I thought delightful too was the way that the language in the choral odes really reverberates out to the rest of the play. The chorus is often problematic for readers and also for audiences, for how to understand what they are. I think Oliver's formulation of what the choral role is, that they kind of look at what is happening, they get us to look at what is happening and take it on, is absolutely right. But I also then appreciate how these odes feed into the rest of the play and pick up images or echoes that then complicate how we're meant to be thinking about what's going on. So an image of a yoke in what's often referred to as the Ode to Man, again, wonderfully translated Ode to Human, as I'm now going to refer to it, Oliver, Ode to Humans. That image of a yoke picks up something that Creon's already said about what it is to govern, that it's about yoking people to your will, which is already a kind of interesting way of framing things. But when we hear it then echoed again in that famous ode, it immediately gets me anyway, as an audience member, as a reader, complicating who that ode is really aimed at. There seems to be a very clear message about how wonderful humans are and their wonderful invention. And then at the end of the ode, a question mark is raised about, whether all of that is entirely good. And that being brought into context with Creon, I think is fantastic. As I knew I would, I'm running beyond my time because there were so many wonderful things that I wanted to talk about in this. But as a last point, again, echoing something that Karen said, but also really drilling down into what is happening in the Greek meter, that is something that is absolutely wonderfully rendered, not in trying to find exactly the same rhythm, but finding this really pacey, pulse-driven, transverse translation for some of these odes. It provides so much material for thought and for teaching with, and I'm so glad that these are now available as a resource for us. Thinking about Greek tragedy is always fun, but it's even more fun when you have a good translation that adds layers to that complication for what we can think about and get from these tragedies today. So thank you very much, Oliver, for that. And I'll hand back over to Karen.
Oh, thank you so much, Lucy. I'm fascinated that there was a sort of stereo effect going on, that we both picked up some of the same things, but from very different perspectives. And so now we have some time to bring back Oliver and to ask him to respond to some of the things we've said. there's so much to talk about, but I think I would like to kick off. But Oliver, you can always kick off somewhere else if you want to, and overrule me with this idea that both of us finished with in a way, which is this sense of how you position yourself between, and how consciously that was done, between the strange and the familiar. That goes both to your position as a sort of scholarly translator who knows the full extent of that strange other from which you're bringing the text, but also to the fact of the translation itself, even down to the nitty-gritty of the verse forms. I think both of us agreed very much that it's a powerful and pacey and very immediate translation. I could hear it in people's mouths, and I could hear people acting this and singing this, but also it holds that strangeness. And I'm very interested in how you achieved that, how consciously you achieved it, how you worked at it, and the choices you made.
Yes, well, thank you. I was very taken with your talking about micro translating, because in a sense, you know, I found the notions of domestication and foreignization very useful talking about other people's translations, and yet I've actually found in my own practice that it somehow breaks down. That as you I think brought out, you want both. You want to make it accessible. Accessibility, you know, is absolutely crucial. So you can't translate in such a way that people have got to look at footnotes the whole time, but at the same time you've got to be able to surprise, you've got to be able to shock, you've got to be able to jolt. I was interested in what you pointed out, Karen, that on the whole I haven't used a lot of Latinate language. You know, there's a lot of monosyllables, and yet somehow by using monosyllables and not using the what I think of as more French language, more polysyllabic language, you can often actually get a jolt, and wake it up in that way. So the fact is, I think that while I'm aware of a certain amount of translation theory, I think I go in for what a friend once called practice-led theory, rather than theory-led practice. Afterwards I can look at it, but it actually, in the actual process, just terribly difficult to analyze. It is a million micro choices. Every single word has to be a choice, even the smallest words.
That fits with Lucy's question in a sense, doesn't it, about the micro level. For example, this one word that she picked up, and you now have become part, this links with a question that's just come in from Rebecca Watts. We'll go formally to the audience in a second, but I just noticed it because it was what I was thinking of, that you're part of the reception history now with this choice of word, and future translators will will look to that and take it as an authority, take it as an intervention, take it as part of a history. Lucy, Oliver, the place of the translator, you know, in this continuum.
Yeah. Yes, well, I mean, it's a marvelous thought to even think that anybody's going to be reading it in 10 years' time, let alone 25 years' time. It is interesting, you asked, Karen, right at the beginning, did I look at other people's translations? And the answer is no, actually. I mean, of course, I know Seamus Heene's translation, I know Anne Carson's translation. It actually happened, I was giving a seminar on translation practice at Ann Arbor, and it was a passage of Deianira, in fact, or a different passage, the one where Nessus gives her a ride over the river and is shot by Heracles. And there I was taught, and then there in the audience was Anne Carson. As you can imagine, that was rather terrifying. And somebody asked, well, do you look at other people's translations? Are you constantly got other translations in front of you to compare? And rather terrified, I said, well, no, I don't. Unfortunately, Anne Carson said she didn't either. So, so no, I don't look at other people's translations as I go along. So I'm not aware actually of when I'm sharing words with other people, and when I'm finding my own. In some ways it's quite lonely, and in other ways it's a shame that it's lonely, because every phrase I use, I obviously read to myself. I say it out loud to myself as I do it, but I'd like to hear other people saying it as well. And Joyce, I love Lucy's pointing out of cancelled, which was actually, I don't think that use of cancelled was so current when I translated it 3 or 4 years ago. Once though, in my translation of Ajax or Aias, I used the word Twitter before, and then fortunately I was able to change it to something else because the word Twitter became so familiar in a different context.
Lucy, did you want to come in there?
Well, I suppose I want to draw in on that, because you mentioned in your translator's note, again, kind of just fully embracing it, the role of intuition, or do you use the word intuition? I don't know, about, and you've spoken, I mean, I've heard you talk about this, how things just kind of mulch down and settle in, and so certainly not looking at translations while you're doing it, but to what extent do you feel that kind of, what is it? I'm not a geologist. The kind of the sediment that's been building up of not just your work as a scholar, but your teaching of translation, and then all of the talks that happen at the APGRD. That's where I remember the Martin Crimp thing from, one of the events that were done there.
Yes, he came. Yes.
How you square that?
That's interesting, and I mean, Karen raised this point of to what extent being a scholar translator changes things. And I think you're right that in some ways the weight of scholarship is a drag. Sometimes, you know, I mean, and some of the best translations, of course, are done by people who don't have that, because they're liberated in a sense. And I can't get away from that. You know, it's been my job. But I think what you're saying, Lucy, is right, that it's kind of sedimented. As I translate, I don't think scholarship. I think sound. I think movement, and I do think accessibility. I want people to be able to hear it and understand it, while at the same time, as we've been saying all along, that doesn't mean making it simple and making it easy and domesticating. In fact, in many ways the opposite.
Let me pick up something else that Lucy raised, and that also sort of featured in my response, which is this question of bringing the 3 texts together. And Lucy, it was really helpful there to remind me, in a sense, that bringing them together was a political act, actually, and a scholarly act, and it creates a possibility of, you know, thinking about these texts together. But I, as a translator, was more interested in whether you found links between them on the linguistic level, whether they were distinct from the male plays, in a sense. So there are 2, I think, you know, 2 perspectives there on this question of the women's plays. I'd be very fascinated to hear, you know, for you, what they perhaps started as and what they ended up as, actually.
Yes, that's very interesting. And I thought, you know, what you were asking about psychology was interesting. I mean, it seems to me, you know, I'm going to talk big here. What tragedy does is draw its audience inside the skins of the people who are undergoing these terrible dilemmas and sufferings, that draws them into understanding them, into see, I don't want to use sympathize or empathize, because it's more complicated than that, but draws them into a kind of into their world. And that's it. It's extraordinary that the men who created Greek tragedy for an audience of men in a very male-dominated society and so on, somehow, for some reason, felt it important to get inside the skin of women, to get into a gendered way of seeing the world. And of course, that's what I've had to try to do. I mean, you know, here I am, the least fashionable translator, an elderly white male. I mean, how bad can it get? But I found it personally actually quite a powerful experience to try and understand the women of these tragedies, and to make them understandable. But whether I've actually made lexical choices, it's the micro level again, I think. I mean, you know, when I translate a woman's speech, I try to translate with a woman's thought, if you know what I mean. But I haven't actually consciously sorted my vocabulary into sort of male ways of putting things and female ways of putting things. It's not as schematic as that.
No, I'm sure that's right. I think translation is never schematic, is it? Now, we're coming up against our time when we open to the audience, but Oliver, I'm very conscious. Is there anything you particularly wanted to pick up out of our responses that you wanted to respond to before we open to the audience?
Well, I mean, there was so much, and both of you said such interesting things. I'd love to have a longer conversation. One thing that certainly, out of what Lucy said, it is true that actually I found the translation of the choruses the most challenging and the most interesting, and also the place where I've actually felt most creative. I mean, one reason I've loved doing translation, and I've only had time to do it in retirement, is because there is a creativity to it. You're not just following; you're also making. And I've found that the translation of the lyrics of choruses, and I've translated the Oresteia as well, has been the thing that I found most rewarding. And I like to think that maybe it's also what readers and performers might find most rewarding.
Can I say straight away, I did.
I was going to say the same
My
thing.
favourites. Oh, brilliant. Well, we're unanimous, but I think it's time to bring the audience in. And at this point, I think I hand over back to Wes, who will field some more general questions.
Hello. Thank you. What an amazing discussion so far. This is great fun, and it's really, really interesting. And clearly, well, I've got my own questions, but I'm here to put forward audience questions, at least to start with. So I will do, and there's some great questions here too. I want to start actually with the second one, because it seems to me to pick up on the discussion that's already happened a bit between the four of you. The question is from Keith and says, the famous debate scene between Antigone and his men parallels and possibly alludes to a similar scene in what he's calling the Women of Trachis, where two sisters similarly argue about similar issues. So again, it's about how much you see these plays in relation to each other. Do you think of these scenes as in dialogue with each other when you're translating?
I don't think I do, actually. It's an interesting question. And there's the pairs of sisters, for example, that Lucy alluded to, the pair of sisters in Antigone and the pair of sisters in Electra. But on the whole, I think I think of each play as a contained play. And one thing that I certainly haven't done is, and I've deliberately tried to get away from, is this notion that people have of the Sophocles, what they call the Theban Trilogy. It's not a trilogy at all. They're three quite separate plays, the two Oedipus plays and Antigone. Actually, Oedipus at Colonus does have a relationship to the other plays, but I think on the whole, it's an interesting question. But I don't think I do think of the scenes as interplaying across plays. Of course, you've got to remember, Sophocles composed 120 plays. He composed 90 tragedies, probably, and we've got 7 of them.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Another question going in a slightly different direction, although there's quite a few questions asking this sort of scholarship: how much do you need to know? How much do you not need to know? Sort of in that field. And there's another question from Keith, which is the famous messenger speech at the beginning is highly comical and almost parodic. Are you conscious of rendering, or basically, how do you make room for comedy and parody in a tragedy?
So this is the guard who, yes, in Antigone?
Yes. Or again, do you not think of it as comic and parodic?
No, I don't think I do think of it as comic and prose. No.
Right.
I mean, and comic is complicated because, of course, there was in the same drama festivals there were comedies.
Yep.
But comedy is not the same as comic in the modern sense of the word. He speaks with a different register, quite definitely, and I think I hope I brought that out.
Yep.
But insofar as there are comic elements in Greek tragedy, I think it's a chiaroscuro matter. You know, that the dark is darker for the light. Right. And the darkness of Antigone, having gone so far in defiance of Creon, is actually brought out by the lightness of the messenger who says, "Well, I'm very sorry about Antigone, but at least I'm safe."
Yeah. Another question is about kind of the relationship between sort of knowing and not knowing Greek. So Gita Ramanathan has asked, is it actually possible to translate these Greek texts without a scholarly background? And asks, for example, how would you compare your translation with Hughes, for example, Ted Hughes's version? In other words, because Karen, again, this picks up with what Karen said, and in a way you've answered this already in terms of the drag of scholarship. But somebody has to tell you what the Greek means to begin with, don't they?
Mm. Well, I mean, obviously it can be done. I mean, Seamus Heaney, when he translated both Philoctetes and Antigone, and he said that he had 3 or 4 versions open in front of him, and he would kind of go between them and somehow distill it out of that. Some of the best translations have been done by people who don't know the source language. But as you say, somebody has to tell them. So and they have to find their ways of getting access to it somehow. So it is a different thing, but as I say, when I translate, I'm not thinking scholarly questions the whole time. I have to worry about the text, of course. And you know,
are you thinking about I mean, you're clearly thinking about English, because one of the questions says, does your work as a translator make you think more in a more complicated way about the history of English or the different moments in English? And again, in a way, you've already addressed that with the presence of Twitter or of cancel, or as Karen said at the end of miasma, sickness, contagion. I mean, presumably, I mean, this is a question for all 3 of you, really. How does working as a translator or thinking about foreign text make you think differently about English?
Yes, well, I think it's quite positive, actually, the effect on how one thinks of one's own language. I think it enables you to find new ways of expression and new forces and rhythms within it. Not so much periodization, I don't think. I mean, I don't think I very seldom would use an archaic word as an archaism, if you know what I mean. Again, that's to do with accessibility. I mean, if you use an archaic word, in a sense, you foreignize.
Karen, you're nodding vigorously here. Do you want to say more about how this relates to English?
Yeah, no, I think a lot about this. I think, you know, close engagement with a foreign language changes the possibilities of your own expression in English. It's pathways or possibilities which didn't exist before. And I think I remember going to a production of all 7 of Shakespeare's history plays over one weekend, and I came out talking in iambic pentameter. Nothing else to be done. But more seriously, it opens your language to possibilities, and it refines your language, and it makes your own language richer and more various, it seems to me. But I would also like to put in a plug for the scholarly translator. I think, you know, there's a fashion at the moment for what I call the celebrity translation. I don't mean to be derisive about Hughes or Heaney or anybody, but that triangulation that you talked about in terms of Heaney with his translations in front of him, that's in your head. You've already that, this vast penumbra around every word that is the scholarly background, you boil it down, you know, into a kind of pebble of knowledge, and there it is in that word. And then you don't have all the footnotes, you know, telling everyone what it's about, but you're doing it already. And so you know, praise for the scholarly translator is what I say.
Yep. Lucy, did you want to add to this?
Well, I only to sacrilegiously move away from language, but again comment on a choice made in this translation, particularly apparent in the Deianira, which is how to translate, e.g. cries of pain. That is something that often gets talked about in the classroom, because the ancient Greek has these particular ways of communicating that with, you know, popoi, da, or and things. And the conversations that I then have with my students, often hilariously very buttoned up, shy students who don't want to be enacting cries of pain, I say, well, what would you say if this was in English? What is the way that we communicate that? And it does sort of take them a while to think, well, yeah, I'm being eaten alive by a poisoned cloak. What would I do? So in that sense, it does open up more conversations about how we express ourselves as well, and really an invitation to perform in a dry and dusty philology Greek translation class. So I thought that was a really interesting decision that you made to make it stage directions, Oliver, in yours, rather than try and find
yes. I felt some translations, I think even Anne Carson sometimes transliterates the Greek cry, although what the relationship between the phonetics of our transliteration and the cry as it might have been made by in the Greek theatre it remains an open question. Yes, so yeah, in a sense, it's an evasion to put in a stage direction and say, you know, cries out in pain, or cries in distress or something. But I felt actually it was better for the reader, for the listener, to fill that in. Yeah.
There are one or two more questions, but I'd like to ask one of my own, if I may, and it relates to the very first passage that you read, and in fact the last word of the first passage, and that's the word male.
Yeah.
Because it struck me as such an amazing decision to put male at the end. Can you explain it, please? Or at least explain the thinking that goes into that decision,
yes.
You know, as opposed to man or, you know, bloke. I mean, there's obviously you're not going to write bloke, but male is such a strong word to put there at the end of that little sequence.
Oh, thank you.
Am I over dramatizing that? I mean, it seems to me a real jolt.
Yeah,
I had exactly the same response. I had it ringed on my text.
That's interesting, because I did also have another passage in mind, actually, a passage in Euripides' Hippolytus, where the nurse says to Phaedra, uses the Greek word is the word for man. So, you know, it says, he'll be called my husband, but she'll be called his. No, let me get this right. He'll be a husband. He'll be called my husband, but he'll be called her man. But I thought that it was more explicitly sexual than that, and it's definitely very explicitly sexual. The same use of the word man and in Euripides' Hippolytus. There are the two passages where that happens. So yes, I made a very deliberate, if you like, almost a sexualization of that. And I think there is more erotic and more explicit evocation of the sexual dimension in Deianira than in almost any other Greek tragedy.
That's interesting, because for me, I think that's absolutely right. And it's one of those little micro choices, really, whereby, in a sense, the obvious thing to have done would have been and said man, which then puts this in the kind of blues world of, you know, I've lost my man to etc. But then loses precisely. So in other words, it puts it in a world where it is about sex and about adultery and who your man might be or not be. But it's but it was a jolt for me. Yeah. Karen, you said as well for you, yeah?
Oh, absolutely. No, I had it as a standby question, so I'm so glad you answered it. But I think it's even more cunning than that, Oliver, because of the sound patternings just before it. You have that, and you have a couple of other things. I read it as mate first. I think we hear that. I think we, you know, and again, that's a kind of brutal and sexual thing going on there. So I loved it. And I'm really interested that there is a background to it, and that proves what I'm saying about the scholarly background.
Yeah.
Translator's instinct just coalescing for that kind of brilliant moment.
Yeah. Sorry, there's one more little question here. I've lost it now. Where is it? It's not a little question. Oh yes, here we are. That's because it's in the other bit of the chat. It's about the sacred and the different languages of the sacred in different languages. So Rebecca says, how does it feel, basically, to recreate or co-create the religious dimension of Greek tragedy? To open a question as that.
Yeah, I mean, that's really difficult, because you know, say with Antigone, she has a lot about what's going to happen after she dies, and that inevitably for modern audience tends to bring in the idea of an afterlife, whether in paradise or whether in hell or whatever, at any rate, some kind of after, or God's love or whatever, an afterlife that is somehow more important than this life, which is very definitely not the Greek way of seeing things, of seeing eschatology. So it's something where the equivalence that Karen was talking about is very, very hard to capture. It's very, very hard to bring in sacred language that does not bring the wrong kind of consequential associations, which is what there's a danger of in the talk of what's going to happen after death in the Antigone. And also, even with things like the word altar, I always remember Tony Harrison in his Oresteia translation translates altar as Godstone. He deliberately says God, because he doesn't want to use the word altar because of its churchy resonance. Yeah. That's the kind of micro choice that one's making all the time in translating from another culture. That's not just, we're not just talking about ancient Greek culture by any means. It's a very interesting and difficult area.
Yeah. Somebody's talking about from Mother Culture, it's Rebecca again, says that man and husband and human are also issues in translating Genesis from the Hebrew. In other words, these are not questions specific to Greek transposition or equivalence or so on. So
yeah, that's an interesting one. And actually, Karen was asking about gender and referring to Emily Wilson and so on. It is interesting how, I mean, the Greek word anthropos is not gendered. And yet it's usually translated as man. And Lucy was referred to this song, very, very famous song in the Antigone, which is known as the Ode to Man. It's not only is it about humans and not about men, but it is also not an ode to them. Actually, it's an ode about them, about human achievement and how it can go right and how it can go wrong. But I did find again and again that I was making sure not to gender in places where the Greek was not gendered, and bringing out, like in the Oedipus, there's the generations of humans. It's always translated the generations of men.
One last thing, because we've just about run out of time. You talked about wanting, or hey, you have a dream that you're the more that some parts of this could be set to music. I wonder if you have a particular kind of music in mind. In other words, are we talking, well, I don't want to say, are there particular contemporary musical forms, or is there a notional music that you hear when you're translating this?
No, but I don't know if I do accept the words must be audible. I think that's terribly important. There was a musical version done of Seamus Heaney's Antigone, and actually I sat next door to him in the Globe Theatre in London when it was first performed. You couldn't hear the words, and that must have been absolutely agonizing for him. If you remember that, perhaps if you've got Greeks singing in the streets in 5th century Athens, the chances are that they're singing the latest thing they heard in a tragedy the other week. or that Athenian prisoners in Sicily won their freedom by being able to remember the songs of Euripides and sing them to their captors. I think I like to think in terms of a kind of music that is accessible and memorable, not a kind of music that is difficult. That's as far as I'd go. Otherwise, I hand it over to the composer. If you can find me a composer and a choreographer, then I would be happy.
Okay, well, maybe that's our next task. Okay, I think we better wrap it up there. But before we do, I should just like to say thank you, first of all, to both Lucy and Karen for terrifically interesting, engaged, insightful, informative responses to Oliver's work. But most of all, of course, to Oliver for the work, for the tremendous energy that you're bringing to this. And also, as Karen says, you know, the skill of the scholar, but also the real sense that this is stuff that needs to be used, to be spoken, to be read, to be kind of out there in the world as well. Thank you also to everyone for the questions and for coming along. My last thing to say is join us in a couple of weeks' time on March the 3rd, when we'll be with Ushashi Dasgupta talking about Charles Dickens and the properties of fiction. Oh, our guests have disappeared. Thank you, everyone. See you next time. Bye.
Thank you.